Hi. So just a reminder, since I haven't been up here since this morning, I'm Laura Rich, CEO of Street Fight, and just another thanks again to Cinda and Kim for being able to partner on this event. So I'm excited. Our next panel is on how innovation becomes a driving force in traditional media, and I just really like this description because it seems so violent, that there's a shift from print to digital has caused massive ruptures and shredded previous business models. I know it just sounded a little violent. And I think that was written by David Hirschman, my business partner. So anyway, let's welcome Trinity Mirror, Axel Springer, Weather Company, and Wall Street Journal. Thanks.
Let's get it started in here.
Everybody, let's get into it. Get stoned, let's get it started. Let's get it started in here. Let's get it started.
Great to see so many of you here, and I'm delighted to be moderating this panel. My name's Sarah Marshall, and I'm from the Wall Street Journal. And it's a subject that fascinates me, of course, how we as legacy media companies can innovate and change and really thrive as print is shredded, or whatever the violent phrase was. Yes, I'm here with Matthew Colburn from Trinity Mirror, Jana Moser from Axel Springer, and Ross Webster from the Weather Channel. I'm going to start with you, Matthew, because I think you're all great case studies where this has exactly happened. The innovation has happened at legacy media companies. So just explain to people a little bit about your role and how the part of Trinity Mirror you operate in, how that works.
Okay, I'll try and keep it brief. Essentially, I run a division that's called New Businesses, which kind of sits separate from the rest of the business. The idea being that the rest of them can get on with, let's be candid, managing the bit of the business that's currently working and generating large amounts of revenue, and we can then go and spend it on creating a tomorrow for the business. So we operate essentially using all the assets of the group. The core ones, of course, from our perspective, are the audience, the brand, and the content. And we look to leverage those to generate new business models in strategic key areas. And we're pretty relaxed. I mean, we build some things, we partner with other people to build others, and we do act. Not quite as a VC, but we certainly make investments into third-party companies as well. Fundamentally, trying to create an incubator, but an incubator whose aim is not to build a business and quickly then sell it and flip it for a profit, but instead to build a business that will allow us to somewhat push the balance back towards, as our audiences grow, that's great. As print goes to digital, audiences grow. We've never had more readers of our content than at any point in history. That's fantastic, but the problem is the average revenue that we make per user has fallen by more than the audience has grown. So fundamentally, what we're looking to do with new businesses is find other ways to turn all those loyal readers, and indeed not so loyal ones, into revenue-generating opportunities.
So you're the kind of agile little lifeboat that can move much faster than the big tanker that you're attached to at Trinity Mirror, presumably. So give us some case studies. I know there's kind of 6 to 8 new projects a year. So what are some of the kind of brands or names or projects that have had successes or failures?
Okay. I would prefer to start with successes, if I may, but having said that, it's a key aspect that if you want to play this game, you have to accept a failure rate. And that can be quite tricky in a business that, as you said, previously had business models that have survived quite happily for decades. So suddenly I'm having to go to the board and say, guys, the risk profile on this new business that I'd like you to put, maybe $500,000, $1 million into, well, it's not great. Honest answer is we're running at about a 50% success rate. That's good because I told the board we'd run at about a 25% success rate. The ones that have worked so far are the ones that we've been able to nurture and then get into the business. And what's been really critical for us, and certainly a lot of learning, is picking the point at which you take a business and put it into the main group. So probably the best example of that was we looked at it and we said, hang on a second, we've got an audience that's growing massively in apps. So fundamentally, we're now a multimedia publisher. We've got print, we've got desktop, we've got mobile web, and we've got apps. App users are our best. App users consume about 20 pieces of content per user per day. That totally eclipses any other of the media. And we were making very little money from them. So we said, well, hang on a second, what can we do there? And we launched something called Pinpoint. And Pinpoint was a network, so we put a little bit of code in every single one of our apps, and we're now doing this for other publishers as well. And we created a network because we said, okay, those users, we can get a geo-profile, we can then sell to advertisers the ability to message those users and to send a push message to the app with a full screen takeover, because banners and buttons traditionally don't work terribly well on a mobile device. So we thought this was an absolutely brilliant idea, and we were reinforced in that because then Foursquare adopted it after us, and so did Facebook. So we went, yes, traditional score one for traditional media. We actually got there about 2 months before Facebook, and we also got to patent the name, which is quite good. So the issue we then had was, okay, great idea. How do we actually grow that business? Because you kind of go, hang on, Trinity Mirror, you've got about 600 salespeople up and down the country. Surely it's easy for you. You train all the salespeople, you say, here's this great new product, you're being perceived as a traditional media company. Wouldn't it be great to be able to go out to big advertisers, to agencies, even little coffee shops, and say, why don't you message everybody in the high street? Because this afternoon you're fairly quiet. We can do that kind of innovative new advertising. You'd think that the salespeople would go, wow, that's great. And some did. But the reality is that a small business is fragile. The revenues are relatively small. We've got people who've been selling big ticket campaigns to major agencies for very large amounts of money, and then we're coming along and saying, we'll sell up £3,000 package or £1,000 package. Okay, if we do a lot, maybe a 10, 20,000, but that's rarer with a small business. Now, my background is small businesses. Closing those kind of deals is really exciting, but getting some of the salespeople within a massive group excited when they've got 6 or possibly even 7-figure targets is tricky. So for us, the win on that was to bring in our own sales team to just sell that, albeit to work with the in-house group. And only this year, 18 months down the line, are we now rolling it out so that all of our salespeople have got targets and they're all targeted to sell a new product that actually is now generating decent revenues. But we had to get it to the point of delivering decent revenues before we could really put it into the sort of slightly brutal, crushing corporate environment that we do try and avoid. I mean, as a group, Simon is very, very committed to making sure that we don't behave like a big crushing corporate, but inevitably with the number of people, the number of publications, it does create a sort of slight chilling effect. And certainly when we buy into businesses, so we took a business that actually already existed called Who Can Fix My Car, and that business was nearly dead because they didn't have any users, but they did have a great idea. And we looked to make an investment, and we did at one point think, well, hey, we'll bring this business into Trinity Mirror. But in the end, we decided not to. In the end, we decided to stay an active and involved shareholder. But that business, with the nature, the people working for it, and the way it needed to operate, was something that we couldn't actually bring into our group. It wasn't big enough, it wasn't robust enough, and the people wouldn't like it very much. So we tried to learn the lessons from, shall we say, the first gold rush that I saw, where a lot of big media companies bought small startups, and they bought people who'd been working their socks off for the last 2-3 years, and finally got someone, they made them rich. And guess what? Most of them disappeared off to the south of France, or they decided that actually, that was about them done, and they certainly weren't interested in speaking with, finance managers about, were they fully GAP compliant in all of their accounting.
So it sounds like different models there, different kind of investments or and where you become the shareholder. Does that sound familiar to you, Jana? I know that Axel Springer's made lots of very high-profile investments recently where that have been widely reported. Talk us through some of the case studies from the businesses that you've invested in.
Yeah, so basically we come directly from print, of course, as everybody knows. And now recently we've invested, for example, in Business Insider and in some other companies like Blendle. So very international and of course English-speaking publications, and that seems to be quite a turnaround. I mean, just go back, for example, almost 60 years we started with one newspaper, of course print, and now we have, I think, revenue of about 600 million per year, and 60% of this is generated by digital. And I think a very huge step in this case is, and the reason for that is definitely that we invest in this kind of companies, that we not try to, I would say, to copy the things we already know, but we try to invest in new things. And for example, Blendle in this case, it's purely online. And they have a business model where you can subscribe on the one hand, you get an amount of money, for example, I think it's €5, and you can access different articles for these €5, and the amount per article is then deducted automatically. And if you're not happy with this article, you can give the article back. And that's, I think, a totally new approach. And it's not just covered by with our articles, and they don't use only our articles, but the articles of other publishers as well. And I think this is the right approach, just to try things out and not to stick with the things you already know, but you have to figure out what's possible and what's not. I mean, additionally, we have some more investments, for example, in early stage startups. And these startups we try to support with our accelerator, for example. We did a joint venture with Plug and Play Tech Center in the United States and Silicon Valley to understand the approach of startups even better, and the attitude they have if they want to change something and set something up. And from my perspective, that's a way to learn how to reinvent yourself. I mean, otherwise it won't be possible for Axel Springer to exchange in that dramatic way. And I think this shows quite good how it can be, and maybe that's the reason why Axel Springer is for many publishers kind of a role model right now.
And so I'm really impressed with that 60% figure for digital. That's kind of quite impressive. And just out of interest, Jana was talking about Blendle, and it's something that I'm kind of incredibly interested in at the moment. Just out of interest, how many people have heard of Blendle before? It only launched in the US a couple of weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. Okay. A few. That's impressive. And your title has data in the word in the title. So talk me through how you use data within Axel Springer to make these decisions to kind of drive innovation.
So currently we have 3 verticals. We have content marketing and classified. So we're not only a publisher. We're still a publisher, of course, but we're not only a publisher, and that means that we have different companies we have acquired or we grew organically. And the different companies we have, most of them are the market leaders, and they already work with data. And the interesting thing now is that we try to combine the different data sets in the group. So what you've seen, for example, at the other big companies, Facebook, Amazon, Google, etc., they all try to create an ecosystem, a data ecosystem around the consumer, and to support the consumer and to be with the consumer the entire day. And that's something we want to do as well. So we start, for example, in the morning with data from newspapers and from the news, and then we want to combine it with more data from, for example, price comparison over the day. We have price comparison platform in our portfolio. Then maybe you look for a job. We have a job portal, and maybe you then want to look for a flat. We have some real estate portals in our portfolio, and would like to gather all the data and to collect it with one unique ID in our group, and to work on one database, one data management platform where we want to share the data, which is currently separated. Now we want to combine it. But that's not all. I mean, that's not really innovative, because just to combine the data, that's what we all do, mostly with third parties. But in this case, we'd like to combine it with a registration because, as I said in the morning, we need a registration because we need the user's consent to do big data in the future. Otherwise, it won't work. So that's the reason why we want to collect the data, combine it with a registration, and how can you really incentivize the user to register? You can do this by finding nice, for example, bundles or incentives within the group, and to offer one single sign-on solution in the group, and not just in the group, because that's, I mean, nice. We have marketing, classified data, and content, and there we mainly gather and collect intent data and interest data. We have some social demographics, but that's okay. But we are missing, nevertheless, some kind of data. For example, e-commerce. We don't have e-commerce in our portfolio, or we don't have telecommunication in our portfolio, or there's some other data we don't have. And there are some gaps in the daily life we don't cover right now. And that's the reason, and that's the innovative thing, that we want to cooperate with other big German companies, and then to create a big data set for the user with their consent, then to personalize websites, to personalize services, and to offer even better services that we can increase our traffic and reach.
Great. And Ross, I think you're probably from the youngest media company on the stage. I think, yes, I think we're over 100 years. We're 127 years old, I think, at the Wall Street Journal. But what was the driving force behind innovation at the Weather Company?
So, just for people who don't know the Weather Company, we traditionally have actually come from a TV background. So 30 years ago, someone had a bright idea to, let's do a 24 hours, 7 days a week, TV station just on weather, and in the US. And obviously, as the web took over, weather.com was the brand on the web, and obviously recently, weather has all moved to mobile. So we're all checking weather on mobile frequently. So I think sort of we've always been sort of on the model we've always had was as a media owner, where we realize that weather drives consumer behavior. We all act like a human swarm. We all do the same things. I mean, this is springtime in London, and it was 10 degrees yesterday on the South Bank, and I saw people in shorts and T-shirts drinking cider on the rocks because they thought that it was summer. So we all do things the same way. And we've always sold those ads. So sunny and warm in London, sell a cider ad. But in the same pressure that's going on in the print at the moment is the digital, and I'm sure the guys here can also attest to that, is that even within the digital ecosystem on advertising, there are a lot of pressures. Ad blockers, verification, fraud, that thing. So that's also a difficult thing. It's also a thing where the agencies and the clients and the media owners, there's a big squabble between ownership of different areas of the of who owns which part of the pie. So about 3 years ago, we made a quite significant pivot from being a media owner to actually thinking ourselves as a product technology company. And that was driven fundamentally by talent in the business who started looking at it differently, looking from it with a different lens. And we started working out that actually where the power was we have a huge amount of data. So our USP is that we're doing 26 billion weather forecasts onto your mobile phones every single day. 3 billion locations. We're a location company. 3 billion locations that we map every 15 minutes. So that's in the way that the explosion of big data weighed up in the ecosystem where what's happening in the ad market, we thought the value was actually within the data itself and building a technology platform where we could actually pull all that data together to bring in non-intuitive decisioning-making engine for clients and agencies to run their business, whether that be supply or demand. So therefore, the conversations I'm now having with the likes of big pharmaceutical companies, retailers, is much more about how we can power all of their advertising with a weather layer to make it more effective. Even though we have 200 million app downloads globally, where we're focusing is actually bigger than that, as in to power everyone's, to power all clients' messaging, whether that be social, on-platform, earned media, et cetera, to actually start thinking of ourselves like, and that's what I mean by start thinking of ourselves as a product technology company.
And that's fascinating, the kind of idea of predicting whether people are going to be eating soups or having barbecues and knowing that in advance. I mean, it feels in some ways that you're kind of slightly lucky or fortuitous with the type of data you have. Sitting from where you sit and kind of looking at other legacy media companies, do you think that's the case? And do you think it's a case of, actually, if you hire some talent, they will find your sweet spots within your organization where you can kind of turn the corner and turn the big tank around?
I mean, I have a lot of respect and for the guys on the panel from what they've said, because I've come from the same sort of heritage background of press, print, and the biggest frustration when I was there was actually getting the people in the boardroom to think of the business in a different way. And in the same way that traditionally those sorts of media companies have always been run in a certain way, let's launch another version of exactly what we've been doing before, another magazine, another audience, and that was the sort of the scope of it. And they'd lock themselves into a room and come out with a new glossy magazine, and then it would follow the same sort of success criteria. I've always thought that probably that it would be an advantage to have a lot of people in the room to say, with the sole objective is, come up with an idea that's totally going to screw this company. As in, what do you most fear about the competitor's going to do, and then do it. And what that also takes is a different sort of talent set. So, I mean, I remember when I worked at a big magazine company in the UK, and called EMAP. They no longer exist, funny enough. Bauer bought them. And I remember going to my CEO and saying, look, in the digital world, we need to go and talk to, and I hate the word frenemies or whatever, but we need to go and work with the likes of Trinity Mirror, like the likes of IPC, Time Inc., because we need to work together to actually scale up and come up with ideas. We own this audience. The most important thing is our audience and our data rather than the actual brands going forward on the digital landscape. And my CEO looked at me as if I was absolutely crazy. He said, but we're on the stands next to them, and they're our competitor. And we can attest to it now, looking to see what's going on, where the big media brands are talking together, because they're going to have to, bind together. And I think, find one more thing, because of Axel Springer, the great thing about that, so I went to a conference, and all your top management went over to Silicon Valley for 6 months or whatever, and I thought that was fantastic, because that was that's why I look at you guys as a real, a very radical way of looking at it. Start looking at the world in a very different way. I'm going to stop now.
Matthew is nodding and smiling and agreeing there, so I have a feeling you've got some insight to add on that.
You do exactly have to do that, and the reason I was smiling is because it's been called the local media subsidy. So local authorities in the UK, as I'm sure most people here are aware, have to publish things like major planning applications, road closures, licensing applications. They've got to be published in local media. And as now that we've bought Local World, we're 210 titles in the country, so we make comfortably into 8-figure revenues out of publishing these notices that, not many people read. And they don't read them because the local authorities don't want to spend the money, so they print them in size 6 font, which is about the smallest they can get away with. So they're largely unreadable, and they're usually written in legalese. So we came up with an idea, funnily enough, that sprang from Pinpoint. So Pinpoint was all about using the fact that we had all these app users, and we could therefore build up a geolocation profile and target them. And I went to speak with a communications director at one of the authorities, and he got really excited by this. But he said, well, I don't really want to reach out to your audience. I want to build an app for my electorate so that I can message them, but I'm only going to tell them the stuff that they need to know. So that, if your next door neighbour is building a conservatory, then I'm going to tell you about it. But if somebody 2 miles down the road is doing it, well, why would you care? So I'm not going to bother you with it. And thereby, we're going to get into a situation where you're only going to send information to people when it's relevant to them, and this will be a great idea. And I said, that's brilliant, let's go and build it. And we did. But we did have, and this is why I was smiling, you can imagine the conversation that we had when certain people within the business discovered that Trinity Mirror itself was building something that might quite possibly hasten the point at which central government turns around and says, well, actually, you don't have to publish these in local newspapers anymore. So fortunately, we had a brave board and a brave CEO who said, somebody's going to do this, and it's best if it's us. But you can imagine certain people in the business were probably minded to throw darts at my picture.
And Jana, the piece about, again, collecting data on people fascinates me, and I'd love to know more about actually how you do it and what you built internally to enable that. But if you're sitting here in the room from a kind of a media business and knowing what you've learned at Axel Springer, and Axel Springer, of course, have been very brave, what advice would you have for driving that innovation? Is it investments? Is it kind of working as a kind of silo as Matthew does, or not a silo but a separate part of the company? What would your main takeaway or tip for people in this room be?
I think there's no real one plan you can have. I mean, even how we do it right now, I think it's just how we can do it, and it's Axel Springer's way, but I think for other companies, the way should be a different one, because it's really tailored. For example, we compare ourselves with Schibsted. It's a very, very large publisher in Norway, but they have another role. They do everything very centrally, and I would say, at least from my perspective, quite top-down. They have marketing classifieds and content as we have, but they try to centralize a lot of things, for example, technology, and we don't. For example, what we do is we try to do everything bottom-up. We try to convince the other companies which are in our portfolio. It's a bit slower, but I think in the end it's better if they do it intrinsically instead of doing it just because one of the board members says you have to do it. Of course, sometimes you need a bit push from the top, but nevertheless, I think they have to be convinced, and the more people talk about data, the better it is, and they are then in the end convinced. Additionally, we try to support within the group with technology how data can be used. So we try to incentivize the usage of data and to find together maybe business models. We do workshops together, try to increase the understanding why data is important. And so we combine the different experts within the group. That's something we do. And I think what's most important is the understanding, on the one hand, that you have to deal with data, and you do every day, and you have to use it. And to understand that monetizing data is your job right now. It's not that you have to be then a data company or a technology company, but you have to understand the purpose of data and why data in the end will drive your business. If you don't do that and you only ask third parties to do it for you, you have to give them a revenue share. You don't monetize your own basics. I mean, from our perspective, it's in the past it was paper which connected our business, and from our perspective right now it's data. So we're still a publisher, we're still a media company, we're not a technology company, not a data company, but in the end, it's more or less the glue between the different portfolios.
Data. Do we have time for a couple of questions? Yeah, a couple. Anybody have a burning question? If not, I will get you in the middle at the back there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, who had the question?
It's the lady with the scarf.
Oh.
Hi, this question is for Matthew. And I actually asked this question of somebody at Johnston Press 2 or 3 conferences ago, so it'd be interesting to see what your response is. Hope it's better. And it's this. What can big directories, legacy directories, the Yellow Pages types, learn from newspapers' engagements with local consumers? Because you're really good at speaking hyper-locally to consumers. What are you doing, obviously other than printing a very, very local newspaper, what are you doing better? What can we learn?
That's
great question.
Sorry, it's an awkward question, isn't it?
No, it's a tricky one. It's also really interesting because my background is somewhat more varied, and I've only moved into the publishing side proper quite recently, and so funnily enough, I presented to the German Yellow Pages business about pay-per-click. Because I was at the time working for a company that did it as a white label, and explaining to them why they really should do it, despite the fact that it would lead to something like a 60% fall in revenue. And they didn't take us up on it, despite 3 big get-togethers. And funnily enough, I think their revenues are now about 8% of what they used to be at the time. So that's partly why I'm smiling, not just from that perspective. But to answer the question, I mean, where I can really only speak about where we're going with this, and I'm going to say something slightly controversial, and I suspect other publishers will get a slight intake of breath. But the reality is, national news is commoditized. You can get the same news from 20 different outlets, and for us as a publisher to differentiate ourselves is very hard. Now, what we have always been good at in the past is selling local media to local advertisers. So you'd have a local publication, and we would have a unique sales team who would go and then speak to local advertisers and say, hey, you should be advertising in your town's newspaper or your city's newspaper. That worked really well, but it was viewed in the past as being the sort of the unglamorous, gritty side of the business, and all the glamour was the big national titles, and all the revenue was coming there. And so I think the tipping point, the big change that I've seen within our group, and it's only really happened relatively recently, is where we started to say, hang on a minute, let's start thinking about audience rather than thinking about the publication, right? Essentially, a reader, an individual, when you start to build a data profile and a geo profile about them, the value that they have to an advertiser is driven from who they are and what they do, not what publication they're actually reading. So if they're reading, the Wokingham Times, which is my local paper, which is a Trinity Mirror publication, or they're reading the Sunday Times, it's the same individual. They have the same value. So what we have done, and what we would therefore recommend to anybody, is start looking at your audience rather than your publication or your offering, and then figure out who wants to buy that. Because what that allows you to do is, absolutely, you can still do what you always did, so you can package up your audience. I mean, to use Pinpoint as a great example, if somebody in a small retailer in the centre of Manchester buys everybody that's been within a kilometre of their store 3 times within the last 7 days, for example, we will actually message that audience across probably 4 or 5 different apps. It will be the Mirror, it'll be the Manchester Evening News, funnily enough, be the Liverpool Echo, despite the antipathy between the two cities. And it'll be Mirror Football and probably a couple of others as well. So we're not even selling, in that case, based on the particular publication, and the advertiser won't even know which publication their message is being sent via. What they do know is the characteristics of the person that they're targeting. And for me, that's the trick. And for us as a media group, we've bet fairly big on that, because that's why we bought Local World. We think local media is the future.
That's great. I think that brings us to time. So thank you to
Sorry.
all the panellists. That was fantastic. Thank you.